Welcome to the Mrs. R Relevant Daily Draft Podcast. My name is Jim, and today we are going to talk about the draftable players in the Ohio State-Iowa matchup this weekend. This is going to be a great game, and this is a sneaky good game for draftables. I counted 26 draftable players, Ohio State against Iowa. Okay, so not all of them are at the top round one, but you want to start talking about a who's going to get drafted. This is going to be a really good game, probably the game of the week from the standpoint of the draft. And let's talk about some of the players at the top. Right for Ohio State, I see 6 players with round one grades right now. Okay, so the 6 players for Ohio State with round one grades: edge, JT Tuimoloau; edge, Jack Sawyer; wide receiver, Emeka Egbuka; defensive lineman, Tyleik Williams; cornerback, Denzel Burke; running back, Quinshon Judkins. Okay, so those players right now I have in my top 32. I think out of that group, Tyleik Williams is the most likely to move down, and that's simply because he's a one-dimensional player. He's a run stuffer. I don't see Tyleik Williams with a lot of pass rush moves or pass rush repertoire to deserve a round one grade. But that's where Tyleik Williams started the season, and we haven't done final draft boards. But I see Tyleik Williams right now, based on what I've seen so far this year, I see him moving down out of round one. Okay. A little bit further down the list, TreVeyon Henderson, running back, Ohio State; Donovan Jackson, guard, Ohio State; Sonny Styles, linebacker, Ohio State. Have them all right in the middle of round 2. And let's also start talking about Iowa here. Okay. We've got 2 safeties from Iowa who are staring right at the round 2 level of the draft board, and that is Sebastian Castro and Xavier Wonkpa. Okay, so Castro, you might see him in the game line up at corner or over the slot. From the NFL standpoint, we're likely going to project him to safety through the draft process. But you definitely want to take a look at Sebastian Castro, 5'11", 205. Wonkpa, 6'2", 210. Okay. The defensive backs for Iowa. And the cool thing is we get to see him play against Emeka Egbuka, who's going to be a round 1 wide receiver probably. So great game to look at. We have defensive backs lining up against a wide receiver, and all 3 are going to get drafted relatively high come April. So let's look at this as the game within the game. The defensive backs for Iowa against Egbuka, wide receiver from Ohio State. So I would definitely take a look at that matchup. We also have an Iowa tight end we need to talk about. Okay. So Luke Lachey, 6'6", 253, is going to be the next in the long line of Iowa tight ends, right? So we get to see several different players match up against Lachey, which would include Denzel Burke, corner from Ohio State; Jordan Hancock, corner from Ohio State; Davison Igbinusun, cornerback from Ohio State. So there's 3 corners from Ohio State with a draftable grade going up against one of the better tight ends in the country. So obviously, usually it's a linebacker or a safety. And we have Lathan Ransom, safety from Ohio State, further down the draft board. So another matchup against Lachey there. And I'm scrolling right now to check to see if there's anybody else. But I think right there at the top, that's a good discussion there. And then we have Sonny Styles from Ohio State, the linebacker I've already mentioned, lining up against Lachey. Ask yourself which of those 2 players you would draft higher. So they are really close to each other on the draft board. ask yourself which of those you would take higher, Sonny Styles or Luke Lachey, linebacker against tight end. Okay, and let's talk about the Ohio State offensive line a little bit because we have a few of them that are looking to be drafted. So the highest ranked Ohio State offensive lineman on the board I'm looking at is guard Donovan Jackson. I have talked to some people that have him as guard 1. So they have Jackson as the highest ranked guard in the draft class. So as you're watching Judkins run, or you're watching TreVeyon Henderson run, they're going to be running, if they're running down the middle, they're going to be running behind Donovan Jackson. So the commentators will always talk about the running back. Can you identify the offensive lineman? Can you identify the game within the game? And trying to help the followers of the podcast start learning who some of the names are for the draft. And can you see how they match up against a very underrated Iowa defense, in my opinion. A little bit further down the board, from an offensive line perspective, we have offensive tackle Joshua Simmons. And there's a couple things that make Simmons stand out. So first of all, he's 6'5", 310. So when you're that big, you stand out, right? But the second thing is that Simmons is a left tackle. And while he may not have a first-round grade, if a team needs a left tackle, in prior podcasts, we talked about some other tackles, but a lot of them are projecting to right tackle where Simmons can play left tackle. So that's a rarer skill. So pay attention to Josh Simmons, left tackle from Ohio State. On the other side of the ball, we have offensive tackle Jennings Dunker from Iowa, 6'5", 316 pounds. And my note on him right here is that he plays right tackle. But at the top of this, I rattled off some first-round grades, and you may have already forgotten that Ohio State has two of the best edges in the country in JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer. So whichever one of them is lined up against Dunker, it's a really good measure for Dunker from the standpoint of if he can hold his own against some of the better edges in the class. Dunker right now, I'm looking at like a 5th or 6th round grade on him. He could put himself into the back of the 3rd round for 2 reasons. This is not a strong tackle class. Okay. So if you're a tackle and you can project, you can show things where you have the right size, the right athletic ability, but maybe you don't have it all on tape. If you're the toolsy tackle, you can still be taken in round 3 just because there's not a lot of solid tackle prospects in this class. I think there's a lot of tackles in this class, but are you a tackle prospect? Are you a left tackle type? Are you a right tackle type? There's definitely room for Dunker to move up the board. Another player that's going to be moving up the board, and I haven't mentioned his name yet, is Jay Higgins, linebacker from Iowa. Now, we've already mentioned that Ohio State is a couple of running backs, right? So we're going to be watching Quinshon Judkins and TreVeyon Henderson run the ball for Ohio State. Well, let's see how they do against Castro and Wampa, the safeties from Iowa, as well as Jay Higgins, the linebacker from Iowa. And then also ask yourself, would you draft Higgins before you draft Castro or Wampa? So on the board I'm looking at, it's a 5th, 6th round grade on Higgins. I think I have Higgins higher. So I would probably think that Higgins, you start asking yourself top 100. This is a really good linebacker class. So that's probably what's pushing Higgins down a little bit, is that there's a lot of linebackers ahead of him. But I definitely think Higgins, the fact he can play inside linebacker, is definitely something rare as opposed to just an off-ball linebacker. And then I think that there's enough there to say Higgins can start talking about him as how close is he to the top 100? That should be a fair question for Jay Higgins, the linebacker from Iowa. There's a few other players to mention. Iowa has a running back, Caleb Johnson. So he's had a couple of good games already this season. How high do we draft Caleb Johnson? I have a draftable grade on him on the board I'm looking at. The question you need to ask yourself is, in a loaded running back class, how high is Caleb Johnson? Right? Like, is your team going to wait till round 6 to draft a running back? Or can Caleb Johnson start putting himself into the round 4 and round 5 running back conversation? A couple of other players. Connor Colby, guard from Iowa, 6'6", 311. So again, we've mentioned Tyleik Williams. He's going to be matched up against Connor Colby. Really good matchup, guard against defensive tackle. So as we're watching, can Iowa run the ball down the middle? It's going to be going up against Tyleik Williams, who's one of the better defensive tackles in this class. I'd say that Williams is in the top 10 tackle conversation in this class. Connor Colby is probably guard 10 to guard 20 in the class. How well does that matchup hold up from a Connor Colby's perspective? Couple of other players, Yahya Black, much further down on the board for Iowa. He's a one-technique defensive tackle at 6'5", 315. He'll be matched up against Donovan Jackson. So it's definitely a matchup to watch. And I have Black moving up the board a little bit. So what I'm looking at, he doesn't have a draftable grade. But from what I've seen from Black, I think he deserves to be moved up a little bit. So this is the Mrs. R Relevant podcast, and we are sponsored by NFLDraftFanatics.com. My name is Jim. You can find me at NFL Draft Fanatic. There's no I in Fanatic on my Twitter. NFLDraftFanatics.com is the only interactive mock draft simulator. And what interactive means is that the fans control the big board by doing mock drafts, and the players fans pick move up the board. The players fans don't pick move down the board. So fans have control over the player rankings. Fans have control over the big board. And that's at NFLDraftFanatics.com. This is the Mrs. R Relevant podcast. My name is Jim. Thank you for listening and following. Please like, follow, subscribe for daily draft content on this channel. And remember, every day is draft day if you have the right attitude. My name is Jim, and thank you very much for watching.